the Opium Wars.
In 1842, the Qing dynasty was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking, the first of what the Chinese later called the unequal treaties, which granted Britain compensation and extraterritoriality, opened 5 treaty ports to foreign merchants, and ceded Hong Kong Island to the British Empire. The failure of the treaty to fulfill British goals of improved trade and diplomatic relations led to the Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, and the defeat of the Qing led to social unrest within China. In China, the war is considered the beginning of modern Chinese history.
The same old game over and over again. It is important to realize that everyone in China and Japan hated Catholics because Catholicism was used as a weapon to weaken their countries culturally before the British also took over the political structures. Until the 1840s, China and Japan were defending themselves quite successfully. Even back then, Vatican-controlled Catholicism had nothing to do with genuine Christianity. Rather, the Vatican was used to infiltrate genuine Christianity. Michelle Gibson.
The year of 1493 was the year that Pope Alexander VI authorized the land grab of the Americas in the Inter Cetera Papal Bull. This papal bull became a major document in the development of subsequent legal doctrines regarding claims of empire in the New World, and assigned to Castile and Spain the exclusive right to acquire territory, to trade in, or even approach the lands laying west of the meridian, situated 100 leagues west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands, except for any lands actually possessed by any other Christian prince beyond this meridian, prior to Christmas 1492. Michelle Gibson.
The Emperor of the Roman Empire became the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. The famous papal bull Unum Sanctum, supposedly dating back to the Middle Ages, was intended to cement the absolute rule of the Pope. The last sentence of this bull reads,
"But we now declare, say, and define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman Pontiff."
Thus, the Pope legitimized himself as the sole representative of God on earth. The so-called heretical Christian communities, such as the Albigensians and Cathars, condemned the papacy as the Church of the Antichrist and considered themselves the successors of the true Christian heritage, which, however, was allowed to continue only in secret. Papal Catholics were accused, among other things, of being responsible for the mysterious fires that destroyed entire cities. The monument in the city of London about the London Fire of 1666 still read until 1830, "The most terrible destruction of this city, begun and carried on by the treachery and wickedness of the papal faction." Western historians confused Jesuit Catholicism with Christianity and accused Japan and China of blindly hating all Christians, while omitting all facts proving the obvious interference of the Jesuits and the Catholic Church in foreign affairs. Thus, regarding the reshaping of the Chinese chronology, we read the following from Uwe Topper in The Great Forgery Event.
Perhaps the most lasting effect of Jesuit work, however, lay in the reshaping of Chinese chronology and its alignment with Western data. The creation of a chronological system was quite new for the Chinese. It was done according to the Latin model, and on the whole, in the spirit of the Catholic Church. The whole process took a century and a half and was finally terminated by the Chinese from 1735 by force. As a result of the immense work, the first complete work of Chinese history appeared in 1778, something that had never been done before in China. There were not only the dynasties, the order of emperors, and their dates of reign, but also the transfer of these dates to the European timescale. Although the errors in it are always criticized, The work has not become obsolete to this day, but has remained in principle the guide for our sinologists, even if they should no longer be aware of it. Uwe Topper.
With this rewriting of the chronology, the Jesuits laid the groundwork for the British takeover of China in 1842. Not only Christianity, but also Islam and Judaism were sooner or later used to control the masses. Because of the nature of the rewrite, we do not even know if the general timeline of events prior to these wars in the name of imperialism is true. The timeline for many events around the world was artificially extended to give more credence to the idea of a centuries-long process of colonization, and to distract from the fact that until the reset, there was a unified civilization of multiple independent cultures that traded peacefully with each other. The supposedly new technological knowledge was introduced worldwide in the course of the 19th century, first and foremost in Western Europe and the Americas. An important role in the reintroduction of the old technologies, in the new guise of energy scarcity, was played by the world's fairs. From 1851 onwards, countless world exhibitions were held. Today, this tradition still exists in the form of the expos, but in principle, they no longer play a role, since there have been no real technological breakthroughs since the two world wars, with the exception of information technology, which is being deliberately developed to bring the dystopian vision of transhumanism to the world. It can be said that with World War I, not only classical architecture, but also innovation disappeared from the world. Before industrialization, there was only one form of sophisticated architecture in the world, known today as historicism or revival architecture, because according to the official narrative, virtually all of these buildings were created only in the 19th century, supposedly as a recourse to ancient Greco-Roman architectural trends. Neo-Gothic, Neo-Renaissance, Neo-Baroque, etc. The basic principles of these buildings were always the same and their quality unrivaled. Is this uniform architecture an indication of a unified civilization that only recently broke up into individual kingdoms or nation-states? Even in Japan, there were these Greco-Roman classical buildings before 1900, although Japan was still completely isolated from the outside world until around 1850. And even after that, after the British had forcibly conquered Japan, it only slowly and hesitantly opened up to the West. The German chronology critic Christoph Pfister writes in his book The Matrix of Ancient History about the chronological dating of European building culture.
It turned out that today's Occidental building culture, the emergence of today's medieval cities, date back about 300 years before today. Before that, according to today's linguistic usage at the beginning of the 18th century, there was still a culture in Europe that can be called Roman, or rather, late Roman. In a political sense, too, there seems to have been a late Roman Empire. In this, however, the political center of power shifted from Gaul to Germania. The collapse of the late Roman Empire was a fact. However, it cannot be said what the causes were. Natural disasters, epidemics, political, economic, and cultural factors are mentioned as triggers. The breakup of the old Roman power created the basis for a new, modern culture. This was, in a sense, rebuilt on the basis of a tabula rasa. There was a turning point of culture with apparently only few connecting points to the former civilization. The cultural dynamic of Europe was expansive towards the outside. Towards the West, the discovery and colonization of the two Americas and then of Africa and Asia took place. The successful colonization of the New World and East Asia saved Europe and gave it a privileged position as a world colonial power from about the middle of the 18th century. The New Europe, which emerged in the first decades of the 18th century, first invented the written language that has been preserved today, and thus the written culture. Art and architecture, too, were largely created only after the great political and cultural break. Christoph Pfitzer.
In other words, the colonization of the world did not take place until 1700 at the earliest, but was backdated by the falsifiers of history on behalf of the imperial powers. Imperialism developed as a reaction to an event, possibly a war or a natural disaster, which wiped out the old, so-called ancient world and left a power vacuum. Western Europe managed to emerge from this vacuum as a winner. Imperialism was kind of a worldwide raid by the Western European powers to grab the countries of the world that had been devastated by the catastrophe. The conflicts between the individual colonial powers, Spain, Portugal, England, Germany, etc., that have been handed down historically are part of the game of hide-and-seek played by the European power elite organized in secret societies and shadow organizations. But these conflicts took place only on a superficial political level because, as is the case today, public decision-makers were rarely privy to the real plans. Let us now look at the story of two buildings. Penn Station in New York, built between 1904 and 1910, demolished in 1963 because the building was dirty and the maintenance costs could allegedly no longer be met. Built in the Greco-Roman style. Ada Louise Huxtable wrote in the New York Times in 1963.
The tragedy is that our present age not only could not produce such a building, but could not even maintain it. Ada Huxtable.
Erie County Savings Building, built in 1893 in the neo-Romanesque style. We read about the demolition of the Erie County Savings Bank building in 1968 in the Buffalo Evening News.
Every evening for more than 3 months, a battle was fought in Shelton Square between her and two cavernous cranes. The latter attacked with two primitive means of offense, a pair of jaws and a rock, or in modern wreckers' parlance, a clam bucket and a busting ball. The former weighed in at 3 tons, the latter at 3.5. The fight was one of the toughest in veteran wreckers' memory. For a wrecker to admit resistance is like a weightlifter confessing his muscles are getting flabby. It began at 4:30 in the afternoon and continued through 7:30 the next morning, 5 days a week. A crowd of variable size would gather to see the kill. It was the show of the town. Whole families arrived in station wagons from the suburbs. The original plans of the building were made available when the crane operations of the 25-man demolition crew began to munch at the building. However, it was evident that plans and reality did not agree. The roof with its turrets and gargoyles and finials was the toughest. A finial, lifted intact like a birthday candle to the ground, measured 3.5 feet high and weighed an estimated 600 pounds. Not to mention the cones on the towers, which looked like cake frosting aloft, but on the ground measured 20 feet high and 15 feet across. Cast iron and steel. As the wrecking progressed, scores of 200-pound red granite carved images, 5 feet thick, set in the walls around the crest of the building came tumbling down, their carnival faces of joy and sorrow biting the dust. The very stones of the building were resistant. The walls, which tapered from 9 feet at the base up to 3 feet, were composed of foot-thick red granite stones weighing up to 3 tons each. Interlocked, they had to be lifted out like lumps of sugar, piece by piece. They did not sound like sugar when they dropped.
If we look at the bigger picture, the 2 world wars appear in a new light. The colonization of the world took place later than we are told, only in the 1700s. By the early 1900s, most of the world was under the control of the European elite-controlled colonial powers, primarily England, France, the Netherlands, Spain, Belgium, Portugal, Russia, Italy. These nations were all already infiltrated by secret societies. Then, with the 2 world wars, European culture itself was largely destroyed, and as a result, people were deprived of the ability to remember. The wars created a collective trauma that made it difficult to connect with the pre-war period. If we look at the earliest photographs from the former colonies, particularly India, we see a world in ruins and people who are not suited to the structures in which they live. These photos resemble 18th and 19th century landscapes of Europe. If we ignore the official timeline for a moment, we can entertain the thought that our world was laid in ruins not too long ago, and that this event allowed parasitic forces to establish a new world order. This new world order is still in the making and has as its goal the complete uprooting of man from his being and his history. The 19th century saw the conquest of the last part of the Tartar Empire by the Russian Empire. The independent, or Free Tartary, as it was called on the old maps, was located until about 1870 directly east of the Caspian Sea in the territory of today's Uzbekistan, with cities like Samarkand and Bukhara. However, Tartary is not mentioned in the official history of Uzbekistan. Anatoly Fomenko writes on the subject of independent Tartary.
Unlike Moscow Tartary, the fate of independent Tartary is known. It was conquered by the Romanovs in the middle of the 19th century. Samarkand, the capital of the independent Tartary, was seized by the Romanovs' army in 1868.
A few decades later, the Soviets, on behalf of the Cabal, destroyed large parts of the Central Asian remnants of the Old World in the name of communism. The First Anglo-Afghan War, the settlement of New Zealand and Australia, and the gold rush in the American West also fall within this period. Consequences of industrialization. In 1839, John D. Rockefeller Sr. was born in the United States. He later founded the Standard Oil Company in 1870. The World's Fairs coincided with the power struggle for authority in physics and the monopolization of energy production, with the sinking of the Titanic and the founding of the Federal Reserve Bank. At that time, the Cabal got rid of those industrialists who opposed the plan of establishing a new world order. The 3 most prominent opponents of the establishment of the Federal Reserve Bank, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus, and John Jacob Astor, all died with the sinking of the Titanic. The Titanic belonged to J.P. Morgan, one of the string pullers behind the creation of the Fed, who spontaneously decided against being present at the maiden voyage. In 1910, the first plans for the foundation of the Fed took place on Jekyll Island. In April 1912, the Titanic sank. In reality, her sister ship, the Olympic, sank. And a year later, in 1913, the Fed was founded with the passing of the Federal Reserve Act, thus laying the foundation for the arbitrary control of the world economy by the secret elite, which had already infiltrated most nations at that time. Woodrow Wilson signed the act, allowing the Fed to issue Federal Reserve notes, U.S. dollars. A few months later, the First World War began the civilizational decline in Central Europe. Nations were set against each other. In 1866, Otto von Bismarck led Prussia into the German War of Brothers against Austria. After the end of this fratricidal war, he did not include Austria in the newly formed North German Confederation and annexed Alsace-Lorraine. He thus created, possibly without being aware of it, the structural conditions for the First and Second World Wars. However, the assassination attempt on Bismarck and his dismissal by Wilhelm II indicate that he was a thorn in the side of the secret societies. His anti-Catholic policy of the Kulturkampf may also have contributed to this. The war against the Germans started with Rome's propaganda against the supposedly primitive Germania and continued with the Reformation Wars. Bismarck tried to reduce the influence of the Vatican and secret societies. The final nail in the coffin of Germany were the two world wars, followed by controlled migration and population replacement. In the course of the 30 Years' War, Germany's spiritual backbone was broken. As Heinrich Heine said, "Bondage is in the German himself, in his soul. Worse than material slavery is spiritualized slavery. Germans must be liberated from within. Nothing helps from without." Albert Einstein published his two theories of relativity in 1905 and 1916. With the general theory of relativity, the ether was finally abolished in physics. General relativity was needed primarily to explain the properties of space without recourse to an objectively existing ether field. Even Einstein was so uncomfortable with this action in retrospect, presumably he realized at some point what his financiers had intended, that he later still tried to clarify that his theories would not work at all without the ether. But by then the damage was done, and he had fulfilled his role of eliminating the old knowledge of the holistic physics of the ether from science. Holistic scientists, like Nikola Tesla, had no place in the New World and were starved out, but only after their skills were used.
Parents, beware. Your children homeward bound from school are being introduced to a new danger in the form of a drugged cigarette, marijuana.
It is convinced that he is hopelessly and incurably insane, a condition caused by the drug marijuana to which he was addicted.
The monopolization of production also included the demonization of hemp. Andrew Mellon, Randolph Hearst, and the DuPont family were instrumental in pushing through the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which raised taxes on hemp in the U.S. to bleed the hemp industry dry and support the oil industry. Banker Andrew Mellon appointed Harry Anslinger as chairman of the newly formed Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Basically, the goal was to create the conditions to make humanity dependent on the system in the long run, and to eradicate any possibility of self-determination and freedom. The 19th century was also the time of the establishment of mass indoctrination institutions, called schools, where state-imposed propaganda was taught to educate young people to become willing recipients of orders. The expansion of compulsory education and the Gleichschaltung of teachers then picked up speed again in the 20th century with the rise of fascism and communism. If the Vatican had not already achieved sufficient success through the consistent persecution of witches and the Inquisition, as well as the burning of books and the destruction of culture, then its mission was crowned with success with the widespread introduction of religious propaganda, which no child could escape. Thus, Karl-Heinz Deschner wrote in his book, God and the Fascists, the Vatican Alliance with Mussolini, Franco, Hitler, and Pavlovich, that under Mussolini, the books of the Italian elementary schools consisted of 1/3 catechism pieces and prayers, and 2/3 of glorifications of fascism and war. The whole thing was crowned only by renewed bans on anti-clerical criticism and media coverage. Thus, one of the basic principles of the old world, each community, family, lives autonomously and is responsible for its own children, was invalidated. The consequent tearing apart of these communities and the early centralized indoctrination were of central importance. Then, with the Flexner Report of 1910, the robber barons Rockefeller and Carnegie destroyed holistic medicine in the U.S. and laid the groundwork for building the anti-life medical cartel under which we live today. Electrotherapy, phytotherapy, and osteopathy, for example, were banned from the official canon, and the curriculum was standardized so that pharma-controlled conventional medicine could establish itself as the only recognized form of medicine. Most independent schools were forced to close as a result of the Flexner Report. The Flexner Report was inspired by the destruction of alternative healing methods in Germany, where the policies of the Flexner Report had already been implemented in 1880.
Throughout his life, Flexner was an ardent advocate of the German pedagogical style of medical education. He firmly believed that medicine was a scientific discipline that could best be realized in America using the German model as a prototype. It was a system in which medical scientists were trained in university hospitals. Science as the animating force in the physician's life was the overarching theme, the zeitgeist, in Flexner's conception of the ideal physician. Thomas P. Duffy, The Flexner Report 100 years later.
Every area of modern science is now dominated by an ideological doctrinaire establishment in which positions are awarded to each other, and it is ensured that real insights are suppressed.
Aan tafel is onder andere Connie Braam. Die schreef dit schitterende boek, dat heet De Handelsreiziger. En dat gaat eigenlijk vooral over iets wat wij niet wisten, namelijk over de grootste cocaïnefabriek ter wereld. En die stond
in Amsterdam aan de Weespertrekvaart.
The British used opium to take over China. In Europe, the Royal Dutch Cocaine Factory was responsible for anesthetizing the population, and during World War I supplied all countries involved in the war with cocaine made from coca leaves imported from Peru. The origin of this factory was the Dutch East India Company. Next to the British East India Company, one of the most powerful trade and power structures of the colonial era. It was through the Dutch cocaine factory, which was supported and protected by the government and had a virtual monopoly on cocaine, that World War I was made possible, because it was only through alienation and anesthesia that soldiers were able to endure the suffering during the war. The Netherlands emerged from the First World War as one of the richest countries in the world thanks to the sale of cocaine. Innumerable traumatized soldiers remained addicted to cocaine after the war, and some even raided pharmacies to obtain it. For even more effective anesthetization of the World War II soldiers, the factory's production was shifted from cocaine to amphetamine in 1942. Michelle Gibson assumes that all the railroad tracks were just dug up and that all of the infrastructure, locomotives, cars, stations, was already in place as well. She speculates that it was an electrified rail system. And after the free worldwide energy grid was shut down, the free energy sources for mass transportation were replaced by oil and coal. The newly created dependence on fossil fuels was one of the foundations of the fabulous wealth of the industrialist robber baron families. About the tramway network in Manaus, Brazil, she writes,
"The historical narrative we are given says that rubber made Manaus the wealthiest city in South America in the late 1800s, and wealthy European families are said to have settled in Manaus, bringing their European art, architecture, and culture with them. It was a city at that time with electric trams and streetlights." Electric trams and streetlights? In the middle of the Amazon rainforest? No road connection to Manaus existed until 1973, with the completion of the BR-319, connecting Manaus to Porto Velho, Brazil. It is 540 miles long, or 870 kilometers, going through the rainforest, and is impassable when it rains. It is known as Brazil's worst highway. There is no such tram system operating in Manaus today. The history we've been taught does not provide an adequate explanation for what was really going on here. This is a photo of undeveloped Amazon rainforest near Manaus. How are they supposed to have built all of this in the mid to late 1800s under these conditions? Michelle Gibson.
Isn't it a bit strange that directly after the sinking of the Titanic and the crash of the Hindenburg, the way of transportation was standardized worldwide so that almost exclusively petroleum is used? And this has not changed in the last 100 years. Why was the public never shown a single photo showing the beginning of the Hindenburg's fire, although 22 professional photographers were present at the event? Why was the static spark theory chosen as the cause of the Hindenburg's sinking, even though there was no evidence to support this theory? Why did all nations stop building airships after the Hindenburg burned? Between 1907 and 1909, 16 imposing American warships with other escort ships, the so-called Great White Fleet, circumnavigated the world and paid a visit to many countries, as the story goes. Officially, the purpose was to demonstrate America's power to the world and to promote cooperation. But perhaps it was simply an inspection of the newly staked possessions around the world and an inventory of which kingdoms had not yet surrendered to the new order. The foundation of the world we live in today was laid at that time during the world's exhibitions. The technological knowledge of the old world was selected. One part of the knowledge was kept secret, the other part was presented to the public. One of the most important criteria in this decision-making process may have been whether a technology could be controlled by a central authority. Any form of free, no-cost energy, for example, was very dangerous to the forces that controlled the robber barons of the industrial age secretly from the shadows. It is important to understand that these industrialists had not earned their wealth themselves. They were born into elite families and chosen to play a role. These families and structures still exist today. Be it Elon Musk, Bill Gates, or Steve Jobs, none of them rose to power and money through their own efforts. But to end with Tolkien, nothing is lost. In our world, Middle Earth, the descent into darkness dominated by evil is part of the process of humanity's evolution.
The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. From the ashes a fire shall be woken, a light from the shadows shall spring. Renewed shall be blade that was broken, the crownless again shall be king.
I came into this world in the rough and ready year of 1923. It was a barbarous time. It was a bleak time, and it was an uncivilized time. My memories stretch back almost 100 years, and if I close my eyes, I can smell the poverty that oozes from the dusky tenement streets of my boyhood. I can taste on my lips the bread and drippings that I was served for my tea. I can remember extreme hunger and my parents' undying love for me. Were stacked